I'm Dan Kurtz-Phelan, and this is the Foreign Affairs Interview.
If the price of getting Europeans to spend more, we can talk about Asians too, is a collapse in deterrence and an end of the meaning of Article 5, you have not made anybody more secure and you've made war more likely.
The American way of war, the ability to find, fix, and finish just about any target anywhere in the world, is very much predicated on allies and partners who give you access, basing, and overflight. And we've started to see some real sportiness, particularly vis-a-vis our European allies, in terms of allowing that, or at least publicly allowing that.
6 months ago, Phil Gordon and Mara Karlin wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs about the plight of America's allies in Trump's second term. What was surprising, they argued, was not the administration's cajoling and threats, or all the ways U.S. policy had called into question the basic principles of these relationships. The surprise was that allies were surprised by these moves in the first place. Almost a year into Trump's second term, they had done little to develop a plan B. The months since had brought a wave of new challenges to America's alliances: the threats to seize Greenland and pull out of NATO, the continued warnings to free riders, the shifting approach to China, a war in Iran launched with little consultation even of the Gulf leaders who would be most directly affected. I spoke to Gordon, who was National Security Advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris, and Karlin, who was Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Biden administration, on the morning of June 1st. We discussed how the responses of American allies in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East have evolved over the course of Trump's second term, and how those responses will shape and constrain U.S. power in the years ahead. Mara and Phil, thanks so much to both of you for being back on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yep, great to be here, Dan.
It was about 6 months ago that the two of you published an essay in Foreign Affairs called The Allies After America. That piece stressed both the failure of American allies to develop what you called a Plan B, an alternative to American support, given all that the second Trump term is done to call that support into question, of course, and also the urgency with which they, in your view, should be doing so now. There have been a number of events since we published that piece that really, for our allies in all major regions, have thrown that challenge into even starker relief. You could mention the threats against Greenland, or the failure to really support Japan in the face of Chinese pressure, the reaction to what is perceived to have been a lack of allied support in the Iran war. We could go on. And so I'm interested in how you assess allied performance when it comes to the Plan B question since you wrote the piece. Phil, let's start with you and perhaps start with the European allies.
Sure, Dan. And that was a good summary of the piece. I mean, you always want to be vindicated when you do something like this, but I dare say that, to the extent that we foresaw a world in which allies couldn't count on the U.S., it does feel like the last 6 months have just reinforced that. And you gave some of the great examples of why that's the case, and added to your list, you could put in questioning NATO or threatening to leave NATO. I mean, we already talked about making Article 5 conditional, but based on Europe's reluctance or resistance to supporting Trump in Iran, they actually started to become explicit in threatening to leave the alliance. So what we argued, which is that we no longer live in a world where allies can count on the United States, I dare say, is even more clear than it was then. I think one thing that's interesting, to respond really to your question, is that allies seem to be getting it more now than they were then. You asked me to talk about Europe. I'm sure we'll pivot to Asia and the Middle East. But the Europeans, since we wrote that piece, I mean, first of all, I would note Mark Carney is not European, but the Prime Minister of Canada actually responded to our piece when he did his Davos speech, basically accepting that the world order that we talked about disappearing, as he put it, is gone. He talked about a rupture. That was like a clarion call. But the Europeans, I think, since the start of this year, have started to get it. We sort of criticized them for just trying to flatter Trump or engage him or give him a trade deal to keep him happy, because they didn't want to draw the conclusions of not being able to count on the US. But the early part of this year, and especially the Greenland escapade, really tipped them into, I think, no longer to getting rid of the illusions that they had. So I think, since we wrote the piece, it's only underscored the thesis that we had, but I think in an encouraging sort of way, the Europeans showed that they're starting to get it.
And what would you point to as evidence of not only kind of intellectual recognition of that, but real action?
There has been real action, but I mean, first to note the intellectual recognition. The first step in solving any hard problem is acknowledging that it exists. And I think they were kind of living in fantasy land for the first year of this administration, or arguably for the first entire Trump term. Last time, they could persuade themselves, there were adults in the room. This might be a passing phenomenon. A new president will change things. And they didn't really draw the necessary conclusions, what Mara and I called a plan B. They kind of tried to do the same thing at the start of this term. Like I said, just hoping for the best, flattering Trump, trying to stay engaged. For me, the tipping point was Greenland. They had already suffered through Trump withdrawing support to Ukraine and making Article 5 conditional and pushing for an unbalanced trade deal. Greenland just cut too close to the bone. I mean, actually threatening to use force against a NATO ally and take NATO territory was just a bridge too far. And so in that reinforced the intellectual conclusion. That's the first part of it. But they then took action. I mean, they did military exercises on Greenland. They threatened counter tariffs. Remember, Trump not only threatened to take Greenland, but he announced that he was imposing new tariffs on Europe if they didn't give it to him. Well, they threatened counter tariffs. They threatened to use an anti-coercion instrument, which they had designed to counter Chinese pressure, and they were going to use it on the United States. Danish pension funds started selling off U.S. securities. They were basically saying, we're just not going to tolerate this. That had an effect on U.S. markets. And then Trump sort of caved and backed down. And I thought that was interesting because it showed the alternative to just caving and giving him whatever he wanted. And I think Europeans drew the conclusion from that. They actually do have leverage. There really is a problem. They do have leverage. And when they unite and push back, they can get somewhere. And I think you also saw action and not words on Iran. So Trump uses force against Iran, doesn't consult the allies, and then expects them to step up and starts demanding that they do a maritime mission to open the Strait of Hormuz, which, he says is easy, and they're the ones who depend on it anyway. If it was easy, we would have done it. But they push back, and you get European leaders, Keir Starmer, who was really bending over backwards to be close to the United States, says, I'm just not going to let my people be dragged into a war. Chancellor Merz in Germany says, we're not doing that. It's inconsistent with international law, and the U.S. has no strategy. Macron, even more, calling for European autonomy. So I do think that not only intellectually have they started to understand that it really is different under Trump, but they're starting to notice that the only way to sort of hold their ground, again, I point to Carney for setting the intellectual framework for this approach, saying, guys, we got to wake up to the new world. The old order is fading. You can't count on the Americans as before, and we need alternatives. Last example, although I could point to others, are the trade deals they've done since Davos, since the Greenland business. They immediately went off and did a big trade deal with India that they'd been working on for 20 years, but couldn't get across the finish line. And now, again, sort of following Carney's recommendations for middle powers, they said, fine, we'll deal with them. They also did a trade deal with Mercosur and Australia and others. So I think, again, if Mara and I were trying to set off an alarm bell and say, you guys really need a plan B, seriously, folks, and we were detecting that they weren't doing it, at least the Europeans are starting to do it.
And to be sure, Phil and I came to this with profound sympathy for America's allies and partners. It is really hard to internalize that the framework you have depended on has shifted so considerably. And then once you do accept it, it's really hard to actually make the necessary changes. So, as Phil said, I think quite unfortunately, our hypothesis has been terribly validated by both the actions and the words of the Trump administration.
Mark, can I get you to pick up on the Asian side of this? My sense is that the story there is somewhat different. That's informed some by what I heard in the last few days at the Shangri-La dialogue, where you had some of the major Asian allies really lining up to show Secretary of Defense Hegseth, who was there, that they were in fact stepping up and, delivering in the ways that he wanted them to, especially when it came to their own defense spending. Do you see similar recognition and action on the Asian side, or is it a different story there?
There are similarities and differences. I think there is a vitriol toward the Europeans, particularly the Western Europeans, that this administration has that does not quite exist in Asia. And they're also a little bit different insofar as, frankly, a lot of our Asian allies have been stepping up in terms of their defense investments for a pretty long time. I think it's actually a more positive story than we've seen in much of Europe. But look, where you've got the similarities is, and we just heard this from Secretary Hegseth at Shangri-La, this view that allies are taking advantage of the United States, the view that these are transactional relationships and they're zero sum. And obviously, if you're sitting in Asia and you're seeing the tremendous power that China is accruing across the board, it almost doesn't really matter what topic you point to, you can't help but be twitchy and nervous. And this administration has shown that that's just, pushing back against China is in no way a priority for them. They made that clear in their national security strategy, in their national defense strategy, and in their actions as well. So, to some extent, I think our allies and partners in Asia have a little bit of a tougher time because, look, as difficult and almost ugly as it is right now vis-a-vis the Europeans, there is some clarity that comes from the very stark approach that we are seeing, right? President standing up and talking about pulling out of NATO, that has got to hit and start to resonate. Whereas you see, I think, to some extent, a lot of Asian allies and partners still thinking, hey, if we just check these boxes, we can find a way for this to all work out.
Let me press you a little bit on the major Asian allies, especially what I've heard from some of their officials and people around their governments is that, they look up at Europe and say, you have nuclear weapons of your own, you have NATO, and even without the US and NATO, you have a real European alliance. We in Asia, if you're Japan or South Korea or the Philippines, just don't have other options. And so the strategy that you and Phil criticize in the piece of just kind of sucking up to Trump and hoping to get through it, they see as their only option. Why do you think they're wrong? Or do you think that it's more subtle than that?
Yeah, I think it's not their only option, right? You have a number of quite capable countries and militaries in particular across that region. They can find different geometries to come together and to collaborate. And you see bits and pieces of this, say like with Japan and Australia. So they could do that both within their region and working across regions with the Europeans, who we know have only gotten more and more interested in the Indo-Pacific over the last few years. So there actually are some opportunities for them there. I don't know that we see a lot of evidence that they're jumping on those.
I think it might be worth stepping back and talking a bit about why they were caught off guard the second time around, which I think probably explains some of the hesitancy to embrace some of these steps that the two of you are recommending in these last several months. If we go back to early in this term, why do you think they were surprised? What were they missing when Trump came back to office? Phil, let's start with you on that.
Well, it goes back to Mara's point about, one reason, whether it's human beings or countries or political leaders avoid drawing certain conclusions is that it's very costly and painful to draw them. And if you really draw this to its logical conclusion, decide that you can't count on the United States of America to defend you, you've got to do lots of painful and risky and costly things, like very extensively build up your own defense spending and overcome barriers. You said the Asians talk about at least Europeans, can work with each other where we're out here on our own. Well, an alternative to that would be to be less on your own and overcome historical differences. I mean, that comment reminded me of the scene in Jaws, where the characters are comparing the size of their scars from shark bites. Everyone always thinks the other, we've been through worse and we have it worse, but they could overcome that just like Europeans did when they collectively came together after wars and differences. But it's hard, and it's hard domestically. And I think Mara mentioned the nuclear issue, or you did, Dan. That's another thing that you would have to do if you can't count on the United States, because everybody depends on the United States. You mentioned, Europeans have some nuclear powers, but to really deter Russia with nuclear weapons, you'd have to spend a very significant amount of money. So I think that's why, this was a good deal for American allies for 80 years. I argue it was a good deal for the United States as well. The current administration doesn't seem to see it that way, which is why they're overturning the entire system. But it was a good deal for European and Asian allies. They had the protection of the United States. It was a lot easier for the United States as a single major military power and nuclear power to deter for them. And they could focus on, economic recovery and development and social spending and all these wonderful things. So it's not surprising at all that they were reluctant to draw a conclusion that they can't count on the United States anymore in the face of increasing evidence. And that was, again, what Mara and I were trying to say in the piece. We get it. We sympathize. We had a lot of appreciation for the old order, but you can't count on it anymore. This administration just fundamentally doesn't believe in that. It's entirely transactional in its approach and doesn't believe in public goods and global commons. So that's why I think they were so reluctant to reach that conclusion. They toughed it out for the first administration. They survived. So arguably maybe that was the right approach. They tried to tough it out for this one, but now the evidence is just too overwhelming. They have to focus on plan Bs. And like I said, I think the Europeans are significantly doing that. And, the Asians are as well, even if maybe not as quickly.
Mara, do you agree with that power of wishful thinking argument?
Yeah, I think that is spot on. A European made an interesting argument to me that part of what's made it so hard for them to accept these changes is because of our long history, obviously, but also because of the kind of pedestal that they had put the United States on for so long. It wasn't just that we were deeply intertwined in institution after institution, but there was to some extent kind of an admiration for what the United States has been, what it has helped achieve. And so, accepting all of this requires knocking it off that pedestal. I would just note, though, Phil just offered up a great case study, though, of an area where we've seen notable progress in Europe, but not in Asia, which is on the issue of extended deterrence. I mean, you can in no way begin to compare the US nuclear arsenal with the Brits or the French whatsoever, to be sure. But the fact that you've now got some real conversations and working groups set up among a handful of European countries on nuclear weapons, that actually shows some sort of acceptance of this big shift.
Be interesting to see how much Trump's summit with Xi and comments on Taiwan turn into an Asian tipping point. Because even though the administration endlessly now says our policy on Taiwan hasn't changed because they didn't technically change it or revise the rhetorical, the declaratory policy on independence, it kind of feels like it did change. And Trump was so deferential to Xi and so keen on building up the bilateral relationship and reducing export controls on advanced chips to China. And then specifically on Taiwan, we didn't change the declaratory policy, but the way Trump talked about it, especially in interviews afterwards, he said arms sales to Taiwan was a bargaining chip, which we've never done before. And he gave that away for nothing. It's not as if he traded that for some concession from China. He just said, it's now up for negotiation. I talked to Xi. He said he talked to Xi extensively about it. And then when pressed that we had previously given assurances to Taiwan that we wouldn't do that, he said, well, 1982 was a long time ago, implying that, old commitments just doesn't mean anything to me if I have an interest. And then in these interviews after the summit, he talked about Taiwan as this tiny little island, far, far away, close to China, and that a war would be a terrible thing. Of course, a war would be a terrible thing. But when you talk about it that way, a war would be a terrible thing in Japan or Korea or Australia or any of our other allies either. And by the way, they stole our chip industry too. So they don't even deserve to be defended. You put all that together and that does, I think it counts as a change in Taiwan policy, but more importantly, or equally importantly, if you're in another capital in the Indo-Pacific, you got to think, well, does that apply to us too? Our treaties that were signed more than 40 years ago, not valid? And our wars far away, not worth fighting? So I don't know. I think, and my sense from people in those countries is that set off some alarm bells there that only reinforced previous reasons to be really concerned about American commitment.
It was striking at Shangri-La that Hegseth did not mention Taiwan in his speech. And then when given the opportunity by a questioner to offer, even just kind of reassuring boilerplate, he refrained from doing so. Mara, if Phil is right that this represents the Asian version of a Greenland moment, what might you imagine some of the Asian allies doing? What would those steps be? And could you, in fact, foresee in the next 5 or 10 years, one or more of them, in fact, acquiring nuclear weapons, whether that's starting with Korea or Japan?
Yes, at a minimum, I think if you're sitting in Asia right now, you are feeling confused. At a maximum, you've internalized that as much as various folks in the Trump administration say, no, really, China is our priority, pacing with China. Those are at best words. There is no evidence that that's a leadership level commitment based on the examples you all just showed. So what does this look like going forward? I think actually there is a parallel here to Europe insofar as the question of our time is going to be who leads on which issues and with whom. And so I think across Asia, they've got to ask themselves that question, obviously vis-a-vis China. And some of that will involve getting together some sort of minilaterals. And you could imagine like maritime security minilaterals, for example, right? Freedom of navigation minilaterals. You could imagine that scaling all the way to what you were just highlighting, which is, can you get some sort of extended deterrence commitment from someone else? Or do you actually need to get some sort of nuclear capability yourself? Which does presume then that we're going to have a really dangerous moment in time between when a decision like that is made and when those capabilities would actually come online.
You said an extended deterrence commitment from someone else. Who would that be if not the United States?
It's really hard to imagine. So I'm stretching here, obviously, with this, but you would look to other nuclear powers. I mean, like in Europe, probably. I think they'll be too stretched, but we have had this kind of Europe flirtation with the Indo-Pacific in recent years. Again, I think this is a bridge way too far, but if we fast forward to a world where it is incredibly clear that the US is in no way playing a guarantor role, if the Europeans do really feel so animated by a concern about China, to what extent do they even start some sort of low-level working group to begin to talk about these issues?
That's a fascinating possibility. I want to raise an argument that I think you would hear from supporters of the administration. Wes Mitchell, who was Assistant Secretary of State in Europe, a job that Phil held previously. Wes was in the first Trump administration, but Phil was not. Argued that, if we look forward 10 years, what we will see is this period when the kind of tough talk from the Trump administration will induce allies to invest in their own defense in ways that, years of polite pleas, to use Secretary Hegseth's words, did not get them to. And we will get that defense spending up to levels where it should be. And you'll have a subsequent president who will kind of get back to some of the more traditional approaches, and ultimately we'll emerge with both stronger alliances or alliances as strong as they were and with more capable allies. Is that implausible to you? You're both shaking your heads as if it is. So I'm curious how you respond to those arguments. Phil, you want to start?
Yeah, I think it's implausible. I think it's just sort of wishful thinking, and it overlooks or underplays the importance of trust in an alliance. Now, I recognize that one reason Europeans are spending more on defense now is because of the Trump administration's policies and pressure. Not even pressure in terms of a tongue lashing, because that doesn't work, as we know from the past, because other administrations have tried that. But because of the reality that they know they can't count on Trump. It's not only Trump. Europeans started spending more first after the Russians invaded and took Crimea. And then they started spending a lot more after Russia's full invasion of Ukraine in 2022. If you look at the charts of European spending, they're much more correlated, and they started really going up after 2022 for reasons of, the threat, and that was during the Biden administration. But it's also true that concerns about the American guarantee have led them to spend even more, and especially the German commitment of this year. So that's real, and one impact of the Trump administration's policies is to get Europeans to spend even more. But that's only one part of the picture. But more importantly, it's only one part of the ledger. If the European spending goes hand in hand with an inability to count on the United States, whether it's just troop withdrawals or, more importantly, an inability to count on the president of the United States to uphold Article 5, the deterrence is weakened. Europeans could spend, X times as much on defense. But without the United States as part of the picture, they're less secure. Russia is less deterred. And that's what this is all about. So I think you can't have it both ways. If the price of getting Europeans to spend more, we can talk about Asians too, is a collapse in deterrence and an end of the meaning of Article 5, you have not made anybody more secure, and you've made war more likely. And the idea that they'll forgive us and this is just a phase, it was like, take your medicine and it will all come out better in the end. I think that underestimates the degree to which we're really losing the legacy of 80 years of commitment to European security.
And look, it's frustrating. It would have been really nice if 15 years ago, when the US was using talking point after talking point, begging European allies to spend more on defense, if they had done that. But instead, we have Putin to thank, as Phil highlights. I would note, deterrence is capability plus will. And I think the contrary view you're highlighting, Dan, is all about capability. And it really doesn't get at that will piece. I would also note that this mutual dependence that we've had on one another has delivered for the United States in a whole bunch of ephemeral ways. But let me give you a really tangible one, which is US defense industry, right? And so the negative repercussion of encouraging the Europeans to really strengthen their own defense industry, which I think is the right move, is going to involve them buying a whole lot less from us, fewer American jobs, less money in the US economy.
You both noted that in the past you've spent probably more hours than you care to count trying to press these allies, both in Europe and Asia, to spend more on defense. What fell short in those arguments, or what do you think accounts for the shortcomings of those past efforts?
I think it's everything we were talking about before of how hard it is. They have domestic politics, they have social needs. They kind of didn't believe us because, we kept saying, if you don't spend more, we'll pull out or go back to the Mansfield Amendment and pressure from defense secretary after defense secretary. But we were always there because they knew it was in our interest to be there. And there was also a degree of, especially post-Cold War, we now live in a world of integration and globalization. It was just hard, especially for Europeans. Going all the way back to Bob Kagan's Mars and Venus thing, to get their heads around the need to do defense spending. Americans, kept being involved in wars and conflict and deterrence, but Europeans kind of reached the conclusion, war was for previous generations and they're good now. And that's why I put such an emphasis on Russia's invasion, first of Crimea, but even more Ukraine. Was like, wait, this is like real. Aggression is not necessarily a thing of the past. There's a major land war in Europe because Russia just up and decided it wanted to take territory. And by the way, and I think this is overlooked, it's not just the ground invasion of Ukraine. Russia has been sponsoring assassination plots and cyber attacks and pipeline attacks, and drones have entered NATO territory, this whole hybrid warfare thing. And Europeans are starting to realize, and packages on airplanes that are designed to blow up, that this is like, we wish that war was a thing of the past and we've entered a new world, we can just focus on integration and globalization, but we can't. So that's why I think they were so reluctant, because it's hard and it's costly, and they believed the US were there. One of the ironies of this whole experience with Trump, I think it was Secretary Gates in 2009, if I'm not mistaken, but around that era when he was defense secretary, specifically said, if you guys don't spend more, you're going to end up with an American administration that just walks away. And again, they didn't want to believe that. History said they were right not to believe it because somehow we always were there. And now they have just that, which is why I'm a little bit more hopeful going forward. Even if we should get a new US administration that comes back, I don't think they'll necessarily drop the ball because they know they're one election away from this being a reality.
I think where this really comes to a head in a spectacular fashion is this Middle East war that we've been watching over these last few months, because the American way of war, the ability to find, fix, and finish just about any target anywhere in the world, is very much predicated on allies and partners who give you access, basing, and overflight. And we've started to see some real sportiness, particularly vis-a-vis our European allies, in terms of allowing that, or at least publicly allowing that. So this may be another piece of kind of what it looks like for the shift to come to reality, and the potential real price, frankly, that it'll cost the US in its ability to do its business as usual.
We'll return to our conversation with Phil Gordon and Mara Karlin after a short break. Phil, Mara referred to one previously unthinkable development that people are now starting to think about, and that's the development of nuclear capabilities in Asia, and South Korea and Japan. Another previously unthinkable thing that I think has become front of mind, you referred to earlier, and that's the real dissolution of NATO. What do you think might get us there? If you project forward a couple of years and NATO truly has come apart, what does that path look like?
Well, first of all, we're already all too far down the road towards that path, because NATO, so on one hand, NATO is an integrated military structure and a treaty that, has certain requirements and a set of institutions, the North Atlantic Council and so on. That's like really important. But arguably even more important, NATO is a commitment that the President of the United States will use force to defend European countries if they're attacked, which is what leads to deterrence, which prevents war in Europe. The first set of things is still intact. The North Atlantic Council meets, the treaty hasn't been abandoned. There's an integrated military structure, there are armed forces. But the second has been really damaged because you have a US president who, instead of making clear that our commitment to European security is ironclad, has said, have you read Article 5? It depends. If they don't spend enough, then isn't necessarily valid. And I would encourage Putin to do whatever the hell he wants if allies aren't spending enough. And by the way, I'm going to start, withdrawing troops from Europe, and I'll particularly do it to punish allies for things that piss me off, like, Germany not helping us open the Strait of Hormuz. And so using it for, retribution. And then you had this little thing with Poland recently where it went in the other direction. They announced that they're going to withdraw forces from Poland, which is also a bad signal given what's going on in Eastern Europe right now. But then because Poland elected a president that is Trump sympathetic, they go back. So just treating NATO, as a reward or punishment system, threatening to leave it because Europeans wouldn't bail Trump out of a war that he started without consulting them, like that just undermines the notion that Europeans can count on it. And NATO is also in the eye of the beholder. It matters less whether Europeans think they can count on it, but whether Russians think Europeans can count on it. And after, let's just say the past 18 months, forget before that, you'd have to say that Putin is less deterred than he would have been then. And if US starts to withdraw more troops from Europe and say that like Article 5 depends on whether allies spend enough, then you have allowed him to think he could use force in Europe. There's a good piece, I think, in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago about the potential for use of force in the Baltic states. In your question, Dan, you used the word unthinkable. Stuff that even in our recent past kind of felt unthinkable, like is all too thinkable, especially when, only a few years ago, Russia just decided to encircle Ukraine with armed forces and decide to gobble it up.
So perhaps actually we've added another argument as to why it is so hard inside Europe to accept this, which is really the trilemma, the sort of the security trilemma they're now forced in, which is, how do you think about a US that may be a threat? How do you think about Russia as a threat? And then based on how you deal with those, how do you actually conjure up an internal security architecture that everyone feels comfortable with? Because obviously history has shown a bunch of cases there where it didn't work out terribly well. And, the steps taken along each of these axes is actually going to, I think, get us to whatever the new vision of European security is.
You could add to that the economic threat from China that is very front of mind for Europeans as well. Europeans, in arguing that they have stepped up in ways that we may not appreciate, will point to Ukraine and everything they have done to fill in for the almost complete collapse in American support for Ukraine. And Mara, as you look at the situation on the battlefield there, to what extent has that European support really made up for the changes in American policy over the last 18 months or so? And how do you assess the state of the battlefield right now?
So yes, the program in which the Europeans buy US material and then give it to Ukraine has been useful in terms of making sure Ukraine is getting a lot of the stuff that it needs. It appears from reporting that the US has maintained its intelligence support to Ukraine, which is of a singular nature.
Meaning that the Europeans still cannot replace that intelligence support. That's one thing that really only the US could do.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what it appears to be. And so both of those have been helpful to Ukraine. The interesting piece that the Europeans, I think, haven't really been able to replace, though, is the US as the convener. The US, when Phil was talking about kind of the formal and informal ways of thinking about NATO, like the US is the Greece at NATO. In the talks about what happens with Ukraine, it's the US that is going to be the one fundamentally that is pulling folks together for better or worse to try to think through issues like war termination. And that's just not happening and not going to happen, I think, in a meaningful way across the European landscape. When we look at the state of the battlefield, I mean, on one level, it's extraordinary. We're 4 years into this thing, and Ukraine still exists as a largely sovereign country that can control the overwhelming majority of its territory. We also see that there have been massive losses on both sides. Russia has gained quite limited territory, particularly recently, where it's not been able to do so at all and has actually just taken greater hits, it can keep on going this way. One probably has to assume, though, that there'll be some sort of shock to the conflict sooner rather than later on either side, whether it's the fact that Ukraine is hitting deep into Russian territory more and more lately, or if the Russians decide, like you might have seen with the missile that they used, I think 2 Saturdays or so ago, decide they need to try to change things up. But if we continue with this like long grinding path, minimal progress will be made by Russia. That's a good thing. And massive losses are going to keep happening on each side. And that's a pretty bad thing.
So, can you see any path to some kind of ceasefire or meaningful end of the war in the coming years?
By adding years, I thought you were going to say months, and then I was going to, say that would be a tough call because the basic stalemate that honestly we've seen for more than 2 years on the battlefield, with no one really making progress, is not really changing. And unfortunately, the bottom line analysis that Putin thinks he can wait us out isn't changing either. So that's why, like months, I would have said no. When you turn it into years, I do think the important thing is, Ukraine, with our help, increasingly less the United States, increasingly more Europe, as you alluded to, has made Russia fail in its strategic objectives. And that's really important, including for the world order questions that we've been talking about. Because, and Mara alluded to this, Russia taking huge losses and paying a big price. Those of us who have supported Ukraine in the 4+ years since the invasion, that includes during the Biden administration, did so not only because we thought the Ukrainian people should be defended against this horrific attack, but because of the principle that we don't want to live in a world where countries can just decide they want to take territory. And I think that's really relevant for everything else we've been talking about here. Taiwan, South Korea, other allies, the rest of the European allies. Ukraine is turning the tide very slowly. So many people thought they would fall in 2 or 3 weeks. Not only did they stop that, they've taken back a significant amount of territory from what Russia initially took, I think more than 50%. I've described the last couple of years as a stalemate. And now Ukraine, with Europe's support, regrettably more than ours, is really pushing back. And so even if they don't, ultimately take all of their territory back, if they do force Putin into abandoning his aims to subjugate the entire country, that will be a great victory, not just for Ukraine, but for all of the principles that we're trying to uphold here. And it's important to underscore the other side of that coin too. The failure to do so would really be devastating to the world order. And that, again, is a difference, going back to the original piece we wrote at the end of last year with the Trump administration, which just didn't seem to see it that way. Vice President Vance said he doesn't really care what happens in Ukraine one way or another. And it's also a shame, but I'll just end on this note. It's unfortunate. The US argument for cutting off Ukraine and essentially pressing it to give in to Russia was that it had no hope on the battlefield. Like, there's no way it could stand up to Russia. And we were going to accelerate that by cutting off military support to get Zelensky to give in. Well, even without that US military support, thanks in large part to the Europeans and obviously the heroism of the Ukrainians, they've done just that. So the US analysis was wrong, as well as the strategic decision not to back Ukraine.
I want to make sure we spend some time on the other major war of this spring, which is the war in Iran, which is not exactly over. It's a little hard to tell exactly where things stand as we're having this conversation. So we will try to step back a little bit. Mara, I want to start with you to talk a bit about what you've seen as you've watched the war itself. You wrote a piece a few years ago in Foreign Affairs called The Return of Total War. And I thought back to a line in that piece. You wrote, "When war changes, the new shape it takes almost always comes as a surprise." As you've watched the US and Israeli attacks on Iran and the Iranian response, both against the US and Israel and also against Gulf partners, what has surprised you? Do you see the kind of glimmers of a new way of war here, or is this all look familiar to you?
So some of what we see in this war echoes to previous ones. For example, the desire for a short and sharp war has absolutely not delivered. And it's clear that both the US and Israel thought that that might come to fruition. I think an argument I made in that piece has also further borne fruit, which is I argued there was the collapse of the continuum of conflict. And what's kind of spectacular about this war is we've seen just a real diversity of capabilities being relevant. So much attention has obviously, and I think validly, been paid to the impact of drones, hitting soft targets in the Gulf, for example. That's been really meaningful. While you've also had F-35s, precision guided munitions as well. Carrier strike groups, which some folks have said, hey, they're not going to be relevant in a certain type of war. They actually are. It actually demonstrates that future wars will very much go across all different types of warfare, low end, conventional, potentially nuclear, right? I mean, we've obviously seen that this piece as it relates both to Iran and to Israel. And so we need to make sure that we build militaries and that we conceptualize deterrence to operate alongside all of those different aspects.
Phil, I'm curious what surprised you as you've watched the course of this war over the last couple of months.
Honestly, it surprised me that we were surprised at the way it played out, or that the administration or Trump, whatever you want to say, were surprised at the way it played out. I think people who followed Iran would have said for years or decades that seeking to change the regime with military force would lead it to feel its back was to the wall and would pull out all the stops. I think the administration and those who supported it made the mistake of believing that because Iran didn't do those things, close the strait and attack neighboring infrastructure after the exchanges in 24 and 25 in April and October, and then the strike on the nuclear facilities, oh, well, then Iran would never do that. And we could just press the issue a bit further. But those were fundamentally different. There was a lot of concern about those, as there should have been. And Iran fired hundreds of ballistic missiles at Israel. But the fact that we kind of got through it pretty well without too much damage, and Iran's air defenses were weakened and it didn't escalate, led the president to think that, he could, quote unquote, finish the job and be the hero who finally got rid of this terrible regime. But he shouldn't have been surprised that, one, the regime didn't collapse and crumble, and two, that it resorted to whatever it needed to do, which included striking its neighbors and closing the strait, which is something that was eminently predictable. So that's what's surprising. And that's what has led to this terrible situation where now I don't need to go on about all of the costs and strategic consequences of this war, but also the inability to get out of it. And we're just stuck. And the president, he's torn between a deal that he would be criticized for because it doesn't come close to everything he said he could achieve, and be criticized for being worse than Obama's deal that he pulled out of. But he also knows that escalating only imposes even more costs on the US economy and the world and our strategic situation, and depletes our arsenals and diverts forces from Asia. And so he's just caught in the middle of those. And that's why, like I said, Ukraine hasn't changed in 2 years. This, it used to be when you did a podcast in Iran, you worried that by the time you finished the hour, 10 things had changed. Now it's almost the opposite. You could probably hold this for 3 weeks because we're just stuck in this holding pattern. We can't do a deal, but we're afraid to escalate. And then every day we're on the verge of a deal, but we never get it over the finish line.
There are a couple elements, though, that are kind of interesting along these lines, because I think you can assume that both inside Tehran and inside Washington, there is a desire for this to wrap up sooner rather than later. So there's that overlap. What's also interesting, if you go to another kind of battle space in this conflict, which is what's been happening with Hezbollah and Israel, you have a situation in which the Lebanese government, the Israeli government, the Syrian government all actually want the same thing, and yet still can't make it happen. And so those are some intriguing dynamics that happen to overlap in both of these and yet don't appear to be delivering different
Well, I agree, Mara, that is the macro picture has started to become clear. Iran and the US, neither wants to escalate. Both have an interest in a deal, and that's why they're close to a deal. But the deal has so many moving parts. You have to figure out how to open the strait, for what degree of sanctions and economic relief and unfreezing assets. Also, which nuclear commitments and on what timetable to implement, and then the whole Lebanon thing. And you have to somehow sequence and choreograph all of those so that each side is actually prepared to make a deal at a time when Trump can't really do a deal because he's worried about his domestic criticism, and the Iranians have trouble because goodness knows their decision-making is, messed up. It's not even clear who's in charge or whether they could, and there's zero trust between the two sides. I agree. The fundamental situation is that both sides want a deal, and we could kind of picture out what it would be, but they're having so much trouble putting this together. The Trump administration is not known for meticulous planning and experts and comprehensive work on this. Iran is in disarray, and that's why we're stuck with everybody losing and suffering the consequences of this ongoing conflict, even though both sides have an interest in ending it.
Phil, given that you were involved in at least some of the early stages of the Iran deal in the Obama administration, if you imagine that deal, leaving aside how these two sides actually get to it, what would be minimally necessary from a U.S. standpoint on both the nuclear front and the regional picture to make it a deal we should take?
Well, look, on the nuclear front, there are different ways of going about the same objectives. The point of the JCPOA was to give us assurance that if Iran did try to break out and seek a nuclear weapon, we would know about it well in advance. Our breakout timeline was a year, which on one hand doesn't sound like a lot, but it's plenty of time. I mean, a year, if you picture the CIA director going to the White House and say, we have evidence that they're going to move towards a bomb, the president had a year to deal with it, to use military force or mount a coalition or reveal it, whatever. And there are a lot of different ways of doing that by limiting their stockpiles, advanced centrifuges, amount of enrichment work, the plutonium route. JCPOA was one way of doing that, and there are others. So that's not, beyond the wit of diplomats to figure out. And the Trump administration and Iran have been discussing such things. There are plenty of ways of doing that if you're willing to do it. I think part of the problem with Trump, and those things were even on the table in ways that would have stopped Iran's realistic pathways to a bomb, both before the strikes last summer and before February 28th. That type of thing was on the table. I think Trump wanted to get more, partly because he could show that it was different from, he pulled out of the reason Iran had a stockpile of 60% material is Trump pulled out of the deal that prohibited the accumulation of such material and use it for Fordo and all the rest. So he wanted more. And this leads to the answer to your second question. He also wanted more in terms of ballistic missiles, regional and regime and protesters and all that. And in the Obama administration, we concluded we wanted all of those things too, and we weren't going to stop pushing on all of those fronts and countering Iran's bad behavior in the region, but we weren't going to subordinate a nuclear deal to get them. Trump decided he was going to have all of that. And, that again leads to the tragedy we're in, because now we have neither. And however this comes out, I suspect it'll probably come out with a messy deal one way or another without details. It's not going to accomplish all of those things that Trump criticized the JCPOA for not accomplishing, with clear restrictions on their ballistic missiles and drones and support for proxies and the behavior of the regime. And so a lot of different ways to do it. And unfortunately, the Trump administration passed on all of them.
And actually, Phil, I think it's even worse than you highlighted, although what you said was pretty dark. And that's because the Strait of Hormuz is the center of gravity right now, which in no way is it in the U.S. interest, either vis-a-vis Iran or all of our allies and partners, for this to be the focus.
Well, no, that's the crazy thing, is now we seem prepared to give our Iran major economic concessions, not to do all this great nuclear restrictions, but to open the strait, which was, of course, completely open before we started the bombing in February.
My sense in hearing officials from various governments talk about the future of the strait is that we will end up with some kind of de facto we won't call it tolling, but there'll be some kind of de facto tolling, and that will be a major change in terms of open seas. And I think that may be a kind of major historical turning point. I mean, Mara, I'd be curious if you have that fear and what that might look like.
Yeah, I think it would be pretty bad. I think if the Trump administration were sitting in on this podcast, the argument they would make is that they don't really have a whole lot of faith in whomever is governing Iran for this moment anyway. And so you cut a deal for a period of time, recognizing that everything's going to be turned upside down sooner rather than later. Perhaps they have a vision of some sort of uprising that occurs. Gosh, we don't have much evidence for that, but we'll see. Or something else. But I think I could imagine them accepting something that is very far from Pareto optimal, under the argument that this really is temporary because this regime is, on its last legs. Which, to be clear, I am not subscribing to that view. I am merely articulating it.
this also relates to our peace, which is about the US upholding principles of world order. And one of them was freedom of navigation. And this would be, such a departure from that, where not only is the United States not upholding freedom of navigation, but doing things and then accepting an outcome that compromises it. That's just a terrible blow to what allies had expected of the United States for decades.
I also want to connect this back to your piece in the first part of our conversation. It's been interesting to watch the dynamic with US allies and partners in the Middle East around this war, both Israel as we fought the war with them, and then also their response to different Gulf partners. I'm interested in how you two see this affecting the future of both the US-Israel relationship, but then also our dynamic with Gulf partners. Phil, let's start with you on that.
So it affects both very significantly. I mean, starting with Israel, already that partnership was significantly strained, obviously, over Gaza. And you look at, public opinion in the United States, American attitudes towards Israel are changing fundamentally, more in one party than another, more among Democrats than among Republicans. But there's also a MAGA base that is not happy with the war or Israel's role in it. And I think the Iran conflict only reinforced that. Again, Gaza was the main thing, on top of domestic developments in Israel, extreme right ministers in the government, West Bank policies, settlement expansion. So there's a trend very much in place that's changing the U.S.-Israel relationship. And Iran just pushes that further. Like, it's now commonplace. I mean, I think you saw the votes recently in the Senate. You had 40 senators for one provision, 36 in another, for withholding arms to Israel. Like, that is now a mainstream Democratic view. And a year ago, it would have been wildly controversial. And we know that because on similar votes, there were many fewer supporters. And part of that was also about Iran, because there was a perception that this was done to defend Israeli security interests. And the administration itself sort of said, like, we did this because Israel was going to attack and we had to, step in before Israel attacked Iran. So I think, as usual, wars usually, they don't necessarily create new situations, but they reinforce trends that are already underway. And there was a trend in strains in the US-Israel relationship that I think this will deeply reinforce. With the Gulf allies, it will, I think, raise questions about also going back to sort of what we wrote at the heart of the piece about allies and Plan B, about their ability to count on the United States. Most of them strongly opposed this war because they had too much to lose. And they made it clear publicly that the irony is, like, 10 years ago, many of them might have pushed the United States to have a regime change policy in Iran, but they made their peace. And partly they made their peace, with the Trump administration. Remember, Saudi Arabia and UAE were attacked by Iran or proxies, the Saudi refinery at Abqaiq, the Emirati flagged tankers in the Gulf. Trump didn't want to respond to that, didn't want to get bogged down in the Middle East. And the Gulf countries, for the most part.
This is in 2019,
2018 and 19, yeah, 2019 for the Abqaiq attack. And Trump didn't respond. And the Gulf allies just realized, they had too much to lose in conflict with Iran. And they're, developing their economies and financial centers and data centers and attracting hundreds of billions of dollars in U.S. investment. And a regime change war in Iran, especially a failed one, was not what they needed. And yet, Trump and Israel decided to do it anyway. It led to what they feared, which was Iranian attacks on infrastructure, which again strikes at the heart of their business model of projecting stability, home for investment. Needless to say, this did not come out well and was not well managed from Washington. And they again, you can't underestimate, they were attacked. The UAE was attacked over 3,000 times by drones and ballistic missiles from Iran. Now, fortunately, they had a significant amount of air defenses, but they're going to need more. They're going to need to rely on themselves. So I'm not in any way saying that you'll see the Gulf partners break with Washington. Some are going out there and predicting they're going to ally with China. I think that the U.S. will remain their partner of choice, but it is a reminder to them of how vulnerable they are with Iran. I think you'll see them wanting to make their peace. They already had kind of decided to make their peace with Iran. And one conclusion that they're going to have to draw is they're going to have to be able to do that. There is, I've been speaking broadly about the Gulf, and it's important, to put a big asterisk on that. There are different countries with different views. And I think you're seeing quite a different reaction from the UAE post-conflict than from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others. UAE seems even more determined to stick with this alliance with the United States and is understandably determined to punish Iran for having attacked the UAE. But broadly speaking, I think for all of them, they know they're going to have to double down on the ability to defend themselves.
So I would agree with that point that they'll have to double down on their ability to defend themselves. Their options are not great. So a couple of years ago, there was all of this worry about how certain Gulf countries were flirting with China and the potential of basing. And I think this war has actually helped put a lot of that to bed, at least for a period of time, given that China has played such an enabling role in what Iran has done. So I think if you were a Gulf country intrigued by working closely with China, you're much less interested in doing that. Another alternative is to try to find someone to give you an extended deterrence relationship or an extended deterrence commitment. Obviously, the Saudis and the Pakistanis have this now. So it'll be really interesting to see if there are any other countries that try to hug Pakistan or if Saudi can try to play some sort of role along those lines. Another piece that I think, we'll need to look at how it plays out is that we have seen some of the Gulf countries using force against Iran in this war. And so obviously the UAE and Saudi are the examples here, but their willingness to respond directly on Iranian territory makes you wonder the extent to which they felt like they needed to show it wasn't just them relying on the US doing what it was doing. And so how does that maybe play out a little bit differently? So Gulf security going forward, I think, is going to be actually a really interesting dynamic piece to look at.
Mara referred to Saudi Arabia and UAE striking Iran itself. Of course, they did feel that they had to do some responding themselves, given that Iran was hitting their cities and airports and energy infrastructure. And they know they'll need the capacity to do that in the future. I emphasized that the United States under Trump seemed an unreliable partner, which would be fueling their self-reliance, but they also have to look ahead. We're talking about things that can happen. They can't be sure that a Democratic president coming in will be as committed to Gulf security as previous ones were, especially if you get a groundswell of resentment over being dragged into Middle East wars, or resentment of even the strategic partnership with Israel, or resentment of the close relationship between Trump and some of the leadership in the region, or a backlash against AI and some of the partnerships we've been doing. So, we've been talking about, unthinkable things or unprecedented things. That will also just reinforce they know they're vulnerable because Iran seems to be, it's going to continue to be a threatening, dangerous neighbor. And they just don't know the degree to which they can count on the United States, with either party in power.
Phil, in this world, do you expect the Saudi-UAE rift to get worse or for them to patch it up, given the kind of shared pressures they face?
Long term, you bet on patch up because this region has many ups and downs and leaders change and, they all have some common interests. But the short run doesn't look too great. They were very much aligned 10 years ago on a sort of anti-Islamist agenda that led them to be working together in Libya and Egypt and Yemen and vis-a-vis Iran. But that has strained over the years, and that close sort of anti-Islamist partnership, on either side, both the leaders in UAE and Saudi Arabia felt the other wasn't living up to its end of the bargain. And whereas UAE went into Yemen shoulder to shoulder with the Saudis, eventually they pulled out. And so Saudis, stayed there fighting the Houthis on their own. And then more recently, the tipping point was when at least the Saudis believe the UAE aligned themselves with separatists in Yemen, fighting directly against the Saudis in a kinetic way, which they felt as a sort of betrayal. They have very big differences in Sudan, where previously they were along the same side, but the UAE is perceived by the Saudis as supporting the rapid support forces, what they perceive to be a rebel group, where Saudi Arabia is aligned with the government, the Sudanese armed forces, and the Emirates perceive them as Islamist in line with some of their neighbors. UAE is working with Israel and recognizing Somaliland. Saudis on the other side of that. Saudi Arabia is trying to develop its own economy and attracting business there, including using visa and other levers to woo business from Dubai to Saudi Arabia. So all of these things going on has sort of fractured that close alignment that they had. And, it's playing out much more openly than it has for many years.
And of course, the region goes beyond these internecine battles. I feel like the UAE Saudi rift really occupied a lot of our minds before this war kicked off. But during this war, for example, something like half the attacks on Saudi territory have come from Iraq. And so I think the fragmented security that's happening around the Gulf is actually just so much more complicated than it will have been status quo ante.
That's from Shia militias in Iraq, not the Iraqi government, I say.
Indeed.
Well, I want to close by asking each of you to reflect on other pieces you've written, not together, that seem particularly interesting in this context. Mara, you wrote a piece in 2019 with Tammy Wittes called America's Middle East Purgatory about the difficulty of successive American administrations to reduce commitment, reduce presence in the region, and kind of laying out a framework for how to do so. We've now had two subsequent administrations that have both professed to want to invest less and spend less and devote less attention to the Middle East. Both of them have failed. You were in one of them, in the Biden administration. As you've reflected on the 6 years or 7 years of continued failure since you wrote that piece, what have you learned about what is so difficult about, in fact, reducing that commitment? And if you were, back in government and an administration in a few years, what would it take to really make that move in the way that you suggested in that piece?
Look, I don't think the Trump administration is suffering from being in Middle East purgatory, like Tammy Wittes and I discussed, because I think that they're all in on this region. I think it is clearly a priority for them. And the last few months have demonstrated that. And the events last summer have as well. And you see this with the partnerships across the Gulf, et cetera. In the Biden administration, before the Hamas attacks on October 7th, we had made some progress in recalibrating our posture in the Middle East. And that was important. And it was really, really difficult to do because there's a genuine tension whenever you start with something and you make any downward shift to it, it is going to be interpreted in different ways. And I think there were real debates over how to convey to the region that its security still matters, which I believe it did and it does and it will continue to do so. But how you manifest that importance can very much differ. It doesn't have to be manifested by two carrier strike groups sitting there. And for example, in the second half of 2021 and 2022, we had none, which was actually really important for regaining the readiness of those capabilities. But to make this actually work, you have to have a whole of government approach so that both inside the US government and with our regional partners, there's an understanding that there's so much more to the relationship than if X number of troops and Y capabilities are sitting in the region or can surge into the region. And I think you need to have meaningful, convincing ways of articulating what's deterring and what's not deterring. And frankly, otherwise, it is just so easy to continue the status quo out of genuine and valid concerns and sort of trepidation of what comes next in this region.
Phil, I want to get you to talk about a forthcoming piece that will be out in Foreign Affairs soon that in some ways makes a case that is a bit in tension, I think, with the Plan B argument, and that you're arguing for future U.S. administrations to do what they can to recommit to the order, to recommit to the alliance system and rebuild it for a new time. Give that case from an American perspective and talk about the way that fits with what you see as the moves that allies should be making that in some ways cut against that.
Yeah, I do have a forthcoming piece I'll be eager to get reactions to. And I mean, you say it could seem in tension with the Plan B argument, but it's actually not. It's kind of the bookend to it. What I say in the new piece, which Mara and I didn't disagree with then, is that it doesn't have to be that way. Allies would be crazy to assume it'll all be fine. And the Trump thing will pass and someone else will come back and the US will hold up. There's too much evidence to the contrary. And I certainly can't guarantee that America will be back, which is why we said you allies really need a Plan B. But I argue in the new piece that we don't have to be resigned to that future just because the current government is pursuing that path. And a lot of Americans are frustrated with the world role. And I try to remind people in that piece, as I said earlier in this discussion, that world order served us pretty well. I mean, of course, it had its flaws. And as Prime Minister Carney said, there were hypocrisies. But it also, deterred war and led to the longest period of no great power war and peace and stability for forever. If you look at this 80-year period, it contained nuclear proliferation. It fostered the greatest period of prosperity the world has ever known. And I'm just a little bit worried that Americans are throwing out the baby with the bathwater and basically somehow have come to this view, partly, because Trump keeps telling them that we got nothing out of this deal and it weakened us. And a better way to run the world is not to care about norms or institutions or world order or the global commons or allies, but to just get what you want. And I try to argue that did not serve countries well in the past, including the United States, that we're actually still powerful enough to play a global role. Of course, we have our troubles, but the US is still by far the most important world power. GDP, size of the economy, technology companies, energy, independence. We still have a bigger share of global GDP as we did at the end of the Reagan administration. So I think there's way too much of that, we're weak now, we can't do this anymore. And so I think that as we look towards the next election and the role the US wants to play in the world, it would just be wrong to throw in the towel and say, let's just, try our luck with the world without principled, strong American leadership. I think there is space for much more optimistic, assertive American leadership of a rules-based order that would benefit Americans.
One of the fascinating dynamics of the next several years is, this could be what happens if you do have an American administration that is pushing that kind of vision combined with allies that have taken on some of the advice that you two offer. So we will pick that up in the future, perhaps.
And that's why I think, Dan, that this is not just the right thing. It's actually possible. I mean, it's always fine to write what the world should be like. But I think one of the ironic or unintended consequences of the Trump administration is to remind Americans of the importance of world order and international norms and alliances. I mean, I think support for alliances is now higher than it's been for decades because Trump has showed us the cost of alienating them, even for, free trade. Trump's tariffs, by imposing costs on the American people in a non-progressive way and leading to inflation, has reminded Americans there are benefits of trade too. Now we got to get it right this time, and we have to understand that it also creates inequalities, and Chinese overcapacity is a problem. But again, on the baby bathwater thing, the lesson I think Americans have learned from Trump is clearly not to just throw in a bunch of tariffs and think like we did in the 1930s that that's going to lead to more prosperity for Americans. So that's why I'm hopeful. Again, I take nothing back from the warning with Mara 6 months ago that no one can count on this. I can't promise that it's the case, but I think it's possible, and I certainly think it's in the American interest.
Well, thanks so much to you both for doing this today. Thanks for the great Plan B piece from several months ago, and for the other work that we have coming in foreign affairs from both of you in the coming months.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you for listening. You can find the articles that we discussed on today's show at foreignaffairs.com. This episode of the Foreign Affairs Interview was produced by Rose Kohler and Kanish Tharoor. Our audio engineer is Christopher Cook. Original music is by Robin Hilton. Special thanks as well to Arena Hogan. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like what you heard, please take a minute to rate and review it. We release a new show every Thursday. Thanks again for tuning in.